Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dana Crumley, and I'm here with my colleagues Amy Dickerson and Kendra Yoch, and we are here to go through the new statute regarding threat assessment teams and procedure. The statute has been in effect since the beginning of the school year. August 26th, I think is the exact date. And we have been working at the firm to create a model threat assessment procedure so that school districts would have some guidelines on how a threat assessment team might run at the district level, at the school level, and what the best practices would be to establish the team and have the procedure operational. So we're going to just start with a brief overview of the law. Public Act 101-0455, and it actually fits into the school code at the School Safety Drill Act provision. So it fits in nicely with the other requirements for sort of safety procedures. The dates for implementation, we had really fun dates for implementation. The first one was December 24th, 2019. There was a lot of back and forth in the legal community about what that date actually was, and that was the date that we determined was the correct date. So December 24th, you had to have a threat assessment procedure into place. I don't think from what I've heard at least that ISB has been checking up on this. So if you don't have one yet in place, it is no reason to panic. And then the team must be established, so established and identified by February 22nd, 2020. So that's coming up right around the corner now. So what does the School Safety Drill Act require? Just a little refresher and review. These are all your annual drills, the bus drills, the evacuation drills. So annually you have to have evacuation drills, 3 for the building, 1 for the bus. You're having them in regard to fire, our favorite fire drill. With students, we all used to love that. Suspicious items or persons, hazardous materials, and bomb threats are the other instances. You're also doing your law enforcement drills, which you're doing in conjunction with your local law enforcement agency, reverse evacuation and lockdown. So leaving the building and staying in the building. And some of these may be conducted, you might have some of these conducted when kids are there and some of them conducted when kids are not present, depending on the age of the students that you're serving and what the needs are in the community at the time. The shelter-in-place drills, obviously, again, another one that we've had for forever, the tornado drill, severe weather, what we do in those instances. Another requirement of the School Safety Drill Act is that you have an annual meeting to review your emergency and crisis response plans. So that's something that you're already doing. It has to involve the police and the fire department. And then you do a report of that annual meeting, and any revisions that you make to the emergency and crisis response plan must be sent to the agencies, which meaning the fire department in your area, the police department. If you work in a district that has more than one, it needs to go to all of them, and then to the Regional Office of Education. So here's where the new statute comes in. Is that it also requires an annual meeting to review the threat assessment procedure. So as we've been talking about this with clients, and this is not a requirement, but we just thought this makes sense logistically, is to have the same group of people that is in charge of performing the drills and setting up the review and doing these other tasks that have already been required in the law to be also part of the threat assessment team, and that you can handle some of these things during a threat assessment team meeting rather than having a separate process. Now, that's not required. You might want to have a separate process, but as we were thinking about this and how many responsibilities districts do have as a way to sort of prevent you from being overwhelmed with them, we thought that this was a way to streamline these things together. So I am going to turn it over to Amy to just talk about what the requirements are of the new part of the law.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Amy. So the law is pretty thin in what it expressly requires. So I'm going to go through what it expressly requires, and then we'll spend the rest of our time kind of talking through our model threat assessment procedure and kind of our approach to that and things to keep in mind. So in terms of what is actually required by the new law, each school district has to implement a threat assessment procedure that may be part of a school board policy on targeted school violence prevention, but it does not have to be. So you have to implement a threat assessment procedure, and that procedure has to include the creation of a threat assessment team. Now, we'll get into who has to be on that team, but in essence, that's what's required for your procedure. So at a minimum, if you have a very basic, standard procedure that calls for the creation of that team, you are arguably in compliance. Now, our model procedure, as you can see, goes into a lot more detail based upon, what, we believe are best practices and practically how that could be framed and structured, and we'll go through that. But in essence, these are the essential requirements for that procedure. We have received some questions about whether or not this should also be folded into a board policy. We know that IASB Press has a targeted school violence policy that's optional for schools to adopt. And so this is an option for schools to have. If a board feels very strongly about adopting a board policy, they may do so, but it is not a requirement to have this be a policy. And there's a lot of reasons why a board may choose to not have it be part of a formal board policy, in part because it could then call into question whether or not, the board has to have, is putting certain things in place in a policy that you may not need to. And more, we think importantly and realistically, you may find that as you put your procedure in place, that as you start to work with it, there may be certain things that you want to modify and change and adapt with your procedure, and that is going to be much easier to do if you have an administrative procedure that from a process standpoint you can make changes to as you go. So for example, even if you had a threat assessment procedure in place on December 20th before you left for break, and you've since purchased our model threat assessment procedure and are now adapting that and are going to put that in place, you can easily just decide to make that change as an administration rather having that be part of board policy. So we're happy to talk to you further about if you are looking to actually do a board policy. In addition to that, how that may be best approached for your district, but wanted to make that point as well. So the procedure does have to include the creation of a threat assessment team. The threat assessment team expressly has to include a school administrator, a teacher, a school counselor, school psychologist, school social worker, and at least one law enforcement official. The law also acknowledges that if a district is unable to establish a threat assessment team with district staff and resources, then it can rely on a regional behavioral threat assessment and intervention team that utilizes mental health professionals and representatives from state, county, and local law enforcement agencies. My understanding is that that particular provision is especially meant for some of our school districts downstate who do not have in their school district buildings some of these individuals and really have to rely on either some of their, their regional counterparts to provide that. But that is something that is an option if a district does not have those things in place. So that's what the law essentially says. We'll talk about some additional provisions that it has in there with regard to record keeping. But as far as what your procedure has to include, that's it. So, one of the things that, it doesn't spell out is, it requires the school district to have a threat assessment team. It doesn't go into detail about whether those team members have to just be on a district level assessment team, or whether if you're going to have individual assessment teams for each school building, whether all of those individuals also have to be part of your school level assessment team. It also does not go into what the specific roles and responsibilities are of the threat assessment team when you're either dealing with triaging an immediate threat that's been made or on an ongoing basis. So what we aim to do with our model procedure is to set up a framework for you to consider how you might set these things up. And so we'll talk about some of these issues and the pros and cons with setting up your district level and school level assessment teams in the way that we might suggest, and ways that you might be able to modify that best for your district.
So I do see a question here that says, what if we don't employ school counselors?
So, I think if you have, and I think the law is unclear on this, I'll start with that. I think the letter of the law requires all the members that are identified to be on a district level threat assessment team. That being said, if you are using a school social worker or a school psychologist to fill the role that a school counselor might play, I'm not sure you're going to find a school counselor at a mental health resource, a community center that has mental health people. So I don't think you can go out and outsource that. You just don't have a school counselor. I think as long as you have a school social worker, a school psychologist, when you look at what the purpose of the law is, and I think that when you look at the different protocols that are out there that have been created by different organizations, including the University of Virginia model, the FBI, the Secret Service, the reason for having this variety of individuals on the team is that they bring their different perspectives. So I think the school counselor is in there, but I think the social worker or the psychologist could bring a similar perspective to what is contemplated by the school counselor role.
I think another thing that, is an option is, so one, I would look to see, if your district does not employ a school counselor, but you are a member of a special education cooperative, that would be the first place to start, is to see if they employ someone who could serve in the school counselor role that would be available then to serve on your team. Alternatively, you could also then consider whether your ROE has potential resources in terms of having someone who can fill a school counselor role on at least your district level assessment team. As we go through our procedure, we'll talk about, ways in which you can set up your teams by having, as we laid out in our procedure, a district level assessment team, your school level assessment team, and then for those individuals who are triaging and actually addressing a threat and going through your threat assessment protocol to actually assess a threat that might occur, how those different teams members may look. So you may, if you decided to utilize a school counselor from a special ed co-op or from an ROE, the law, that could be somebody who's just sitting on your district level assessment team that's reviewing things sort of on an ongoing basis, but not somebody who you're going to be calling upon, when something actually happens in the immediate.
Yeah, I guess I'll just go on record. I think this part of the law is silly and redundant, and I think that they would have been better off to specify that they're looking for an individual with appropriate licensure that understands both the curriculum in the school and the expectations that students have, but also the mental health aspects of the special ed program, the counseling programs that are in place, the resources that are in place, and sort of the expectations for coping and things for kids of that age level. You know, counselors are becoming, I think, more and more a high school thing where the counselor sets the schedule and they have less of a mental health role anyways.
Yep.
I don't know if they put that in the statute to sort of capture the idea of a school counselor that might have been more in place, you know, 20 years ago before, you know, like
We had
school.
so many social workers.
We had so many social workers and psychologists.
Yep.
So that may just be also a way to address some school districts that are smaller and more rural and maybe don't have the same level of mental health services available to students. So I wouldn't lose sleep over that, I guess.
Okay, so let's turn to our model threat assessment procedure. As Amy said, what is in the actual law has very little detail. There are very few requirements other than just setting up that threat assessment team. And so we've kind of looked through some of the resources that are available. We've been to a number of conferences and things put on, you know, in conjunction with the FBI and the Secret Service and Dewey Cornell at the University of Virginia, to try and get an idea of what are the best practices. How can we actually set this up to be a functioning group within your school that is not just called upon when you have an immediate threat, but has a working relationship with each other, has some ideas about roles and responsibilities, and can be more of an integrated part of your school. So that's what we've tried to set out to do. And so I think one thing to start with is sort of the difference between this procedure versus your protocol. And the protocol is going to be the specific response plan that you've adopted, and it could be that University of Virginia model. The Secret Service has a model. There are a handful of different models out there, and we have some resources at the end of the presentation that you can look at and decide kind of what makes the most sense for your school. But it is really that specific when you receive some sort of threat or other information about potential targeted violence at the school, these are the steps you take. This is how you evaluate it, and this is how you respond. The procedure, on the other hand, is broader and more comprehensive. And so it's going to create that threat assessment team, guide its operation, and kind of figure out how are we identifying threats in the first place, what is our kind of bigger response plan, what do our safety plans look like, and guide that process so that you do have those meetings even when there's not an immediate threat. You put those systems in place on a more comprehensive and global level. So those are kind of two different things, just something to keep in mind. So responsibilities of the threat assessment team. And again, we do want to view this team as something bigger than just when you have an immediate threat. It's going to be operating throughout the school year, regardless of whether you have a current threat. So one thing is going to be to assess potential improvements in your safety procedures. And that, you know, Dana talked about the different safety drills that are required already, that you already have in place, and kind of thinking about how that fits in the drills you already do, the lockdown drills, the coordination with the police. You know, are those up to par? Are those as robust as they should be? And thinking about those from a safety perspective and threat perspective as well. Also, school-wide prevention programs, things about school culture, school climate, student mental health more generally, as far as how are we caring for students and staff and making sure that needs are met, and when there are issues that we are able to identify them. The second thing we have here is reviewing the process for receiving and gathering information on threats. So if someone hears about a potential threat, do they know who to go to? Who do they report it to? Do you have an anonymous system for reporting threats? And how are you going to get information about whether or not that's a credible threat, whether it's, you know, what kind of problem it might be? The team is also responsible for monitoring the effectiveness of support services, and then also identifying additional resources. So what you have within the school is going to be one part of a plan for helping a student who may have made a threat or may have been a target of a threat, but then looking into your community to figure out how else you can support those people. And then training team members as well as other people in your school community about these procedures and their roles in this process.
Kendra, it looks like we have a question about whether the law says how often the threat assessment team has to meet.
The law does not specify how often the threat assessment team has to meet.
However, in speaking to some of our contacts at the FBI locally, in speaking to experts in the field, monthly is really the recommendation. I think our question was, should it meet monthly, should it meet quarterly? And I think in order to be robust and to do some of the activities in a very thorough, comprehensive way, a monthly meeting is important. I know it's a lot on you and you guys have a lot to do, but it follows the general principle of the more you meet and you run through situations and you plan, when you have an actual situation, you will be better prepared to deal with that. So it's more of an ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure. And I think that's what the law enforcement experts and the psychology experts are saying over and over again, that even if you don't have safety plans to review, or you're not resolving, you're not talking about resolving threats that have been in the building in the past, that you're doing table exercises, that you're reviewing procedures, that you're talking about how are we going to continue to get the people trained who need to be trained to address threats that arise in the building when maybe all of us aren't available or people are out, or to make sure that we have the deep bench that we need to really handle these problems.
Okay, so one of the responsibilities of the team is to identify threats. And threats and threatening behavior can come from a variety of different people and places. And I think oftentimes we're thinking about students as where the threat could come from, but it really could be anybody in the community. It could be parents, employees, people who are related to the students in your school, contractors, really anybody off the street. And so I think we want to sometimes take a step back and think about it a little bit more broadly as far as what the team's role is going to be and how are we going to get information if there is a threat from one of these other populations. How does that information make it to our threat assessment team? And some of that may be cooperation with your law enforcement agency. Some of that may be setting up a tip line that people, not just students, but families and people in the community know about. We saw, I think Colorado has some really interesting, a statewide system that's set up, and there's a place or a call center where the calls are received and people can really sort of identify the level of the threat and what resources are needed and then get the information to the people who need to know it. And, I don't think in Illinois we have something like that set up yet. And so it is up to districts to kind of figure out for your own community, how are you going to get that information and encourage people to report it so that you can deal with it, because you can't take steps to deal with a threat that you're not aware of. So our model procedure does include both a district level team and a school level team. The structure that you adopt is going to depend on the size of your district and sort of how many schools you have and what that organization looks like. Like we said, the law actually just requires a district team. We think that a school level team is probably better equipped to deal with the day-to-day things that come to the attention of your school, as far as, you're going to have relationships with those students and those parents and those employees, and so be in a good position to deal with that. So we do recommend, especially if you have multiple schools, to have both that district level and a school level teams.
And to that point, I think that we've set up our model procedure to call for both your district level and your school level teams to include the individuals who are required under the law to be on the threat assessment team, plus some additional individuals that we've suggested be included. That said, the law just, technically would require that you're one of those teams, arguably the district level team, have those individuals. So if you really felt like your school level threat assessment team, you really wanted to modify that in some way, the law may allow for that. We're happy to talk, individually to you if you're considering modifying that and want to, ensure compliance. We're happy to talk specifically about that. But as suggested, sort of most consistent conservative approach would be to include those required members on both your district and school level teams. We've also included alternate team members as a recommendation because the law does say that the individuals who are supposed to be on the team have to be available to serve. So by having alternate team members trained and ready to serve if needed will help you comply with ensuring that if someone becomes unavailable to serve on the team, that you'll have somebody on standby in place.
And I was just looking, I saw we had a question about whether Safe to Help in Illinois has been implemented. And I just did a quick search. It looks like this is something part of the Illinois Anti-Terrorism Task Force. I don't know that it's up yet, but I haven't looked at it in depth. So it's something we absolutely want to look into further because that would be a great resource to have. Additional support. So these are not required members of your team, but in certain situations, when you do have a threat that, maybe you're trying to figure out how serious is it, we don't really know, how to interpret this or how to look through all of our information, using a forensic psychologist, as distinguished from just your school psychologist, has a different level of expertise, a different set, a different perspective, may be warranted, and we can kind of talk with you about people who might be available to help in that type of situation. And you can see we have a little star there that you would want some sort of agreement regarding information sharing, especially if it's a student and you're going to be sharing student information, that person is sort of working as a school official to help in this particular capacity. The school attorney can also serve on your team on a regular basis or, as the need arises. And I think as we go through this, some of the things that come up that would be particularly legal questions have a lot to do with that information sharing question, confidentiality, trying to really better understand the risk and what the different, possible liabilities could be. It may make sense for you to have either always or as the need arises, your school attorney be part of that team.
I think one area where the school attorney really does need to have sort of initial involvement in threat assessment is when the threat assessment involves an employee. Mm-hmm. I think you need to start, it's best practice to start utilizing the resources of your school attorney immediately if you think there's an employee who may be unsafe or engaging in behavior that, might pose a risk to the rest of the school community. The attorney can also be a resource if you have employees that are dealing with domestic violence situation, outside court situations that might spill over or impact the safety of the school environment in some way. So you have to remember this is not just for students, but this is threats from all sources, really trying to prevent those from becoming, actualized across setting.
Right. We did have information again that Safe to Help program was presented at III, so I'm sure that they know what they're talking about, which is excellent, and we'll definitely look into that more. And then a question about, in a smaller district, having a district meeting that's quarterly and a building meeting that's monthly. You can set that up however it makes sense for your district.
Yeah,
absolutely fine.
Yeah, as we indicated in the cover letter, if you are a one building district, it may make sense for you to have just one threat assessment team to make that, clear and easy as to who those individuals are, and that's sufficient.
I think the message is that the people that are doing the threat assessment should have regular touches with the practice of threat assessment. And so monthly meetings in the school, quarterly meetings at the district level would meet that objective.
Yeah. Other considerations, especially for your district level team, thinking about that overlap with your school level team and having some of the people who are on school level teams might also serve on your district level team to get some better coordination and make sure everybody's kind of working together, sharing information, using the same systems and protocols. Having the director of HR available, especially like Dana said, when you have an employee who's the person who may be posing a threat or the subject of a threat, would be important. And then if you have a director of communications or somebody else who's in a similar role, when a threat comes in that people are aware of, that can create a lot of, panic and, people being very concerned about it, parents, in the community, and how do you address that? What information can you share, and how do you share it in a way that is honest and accurate and truthful and helpful? Your director of communications or somebody similar can help with that piece of it.
I think we've talked a lot about already, why we recommend in the procedure and in practice having monthly regular meetings for the threat assessment team. And so with the procedure, I think the key here is what you adopt in your procedure should be what you plan to do in practice. And so if having monthly meetings in your procedure, make sure that you meet monthly. We've indicated in the procedure a number of things that would be considered by the threat assessment team at those monthly meetings. Review those. They are suggested, but can be adapted. There are things to consider. There may be things that you feel like you will commit now to be reviewing on a monthly basis, and then perhaps some additional things maybe you don't include in your procedure right away, but then we'll add to it as your monthly meetings get going. We've identified, that there's the requirement that you meet on an annual basis to review the threat assessment procedure, but otherwise there's just additional steps that are additional items that we've recommended be included. I think we've gone through those. One thing I'll note again is, I would take advantage of during those meetings when, especially if you're not utilizing those when needed to monitor safety plans, if there hasn't been something that you need to monitor or review, if you haven't yet had a threat assessment that you've actually reviewing how that went, is actually looking to review the training that you have in place for not just your staff to know who they should be reporting any threat that they observe or receive, but also reviewing what training you're providing to students and parents and pushing out information to ensure that your frontline staff and your district are receiving threats that come in so that you're being able to provide that comprehensive approach for your district. Also utilizing those monthly meetings to practice scenarios of how you might be implementing your threat assessment protocols can be a great advantage and benefit for your team, so that even if you are not actually having to in real life implement your threat assessment protocols in a recent time, utilizing your monthly meetings to actually go through scenarios can better equip your teams to actually implement the protocols when you have to do so.
So we had another question that is related. Can schools mandate a mental health assessment before a student can return to school? I think that's a hard question to answer in the general. I think if I were to give a general answer, I would say probably not. You can't mandate it. There would be some circumstances where you might have a special ed student and you were in a 45-day placement scenario, meaning that the student had committed some offense at school that implicated the 45-day placement rule, and you put them in a placement, you might be able to have a hearing officer order a mental health assessment as part of that process. Generally, what we recommend when we think a student needs a mental health assessment is that you offer to do it and pay for it, because sometimes, even though you can't mandate it, if you say that you're going to do it and facilitate it and pay for it, that will, encourage the parent of the importance of it. The other thing to consider is whether or not you want to look at if a student commits an offense that is, might be expellable or might subject them to severe discipline, is that you look at alternatives to that discipline, maybe alternative placement, and make that alternative placement or that alternative part of that alternative disciplinary process include the mental health assessment. So that's how we would recommend addressing it. But currently, There is no law that allows you to mandate a mental health assessment.
I see another question here that says that this district works with 3 different law enforcement agencies, and do we recommend intergovernmental agreements with a person in each agency?
Yes, we would, is the short answer. And we'll get into in a little bit here some what our best practice recommendations are for those intergovernmental agreements, but in short, we would recommend doing so.
And a follow-up question is whether the law enforcement official needs to participate in the monthly meetings or should just be looped in on a less frequent basis.
So best practice would be that they be involved on a monthly basis. One of the things we hear a lot from trainings with whether it's with Dr. Cornell or in some of the FBI trainings we sat in is the importance of collaboration with law enforcement with these issues. And so having them involved in those monthly meetings will help to foster that collaboration and trust and communication. So when you really need to utilize it in an emergency situation, it will be as smooth as possible.
And I think the other point is a point that we've already made, but they just bring such a different perspective. Their day-to-day experience with the public, with situations that are stressful, where people are under duress, brings a different perspective to the team that is a valuable perspective. So, you know, making those connections and fostering those connections are important.
Yep. And another thing we've heard time and again is the importance of monitoring after, you know, an initial threat that's come in has been resolved and you put into place certain steps or a safety plan for the student. And so utilizing those monthly meetings that we've talked about to monitor plans that you put in place, to monitor students that have, you know, come through the threat assessment process, and monitoring and from sort of reviewing how things have gone in the past and what you can learn in terms of lessons learned with situations you've had can be very important. So in addition then to your monthly meetings, we identify in the procedure what we're referring to as triage meetings, which are really those meetings that would be held as an as-needed basis where you're implementing that threat assessment protocol to assess a specific threat that has come in or a specific situation where you're assessing whether or not an individual poses a threat and assessing whether or not, you know, how you're going to respond. We have set up in the procedure a suggested framework for how to facilitate convening this triage meeting. The law does not require that it be all the members of the threat assessment team. So practically, if it's only just your 2 or 3 members, an administrator, a mental health professional, perhaps your SRO, that's fine. And so we've called for the procedure, you know, to consider how that and to allow for some flexibility there depending upon the situation. But that triage meeting, the purpose of that will really be when you're implementing your threat assessment protocol, going through the steps to gather facts on that specific threat that comes through and implementing a protocol like Dr. Cornell's protocol or another one that you may be utilizing to review whether or not it's a credible, real threat, transient threat, or substantive threat. Those are terms that Dr. Cornell's program uses, and implementing it in that way.
Okay, so when we're talking about assessing and responding to particular threats, that is really when your protocol comes into place. And I think, you know, one of the things we have highlighted here is developing and implementing a safety intervention plan. And different protocols may have different terms for that. You can adopt the term that, you know, you think fits best. We're trying to avoid something that sounded too much like a behavior improvement plan, just to avoid confusion with those which would be separate. And I think, you know, one thing that's important to think about here is we're looking on interventions on an integrated approach and not just discipline. I think oftentimes when you have a student who's made a threat, the first kind of reaction of a lot of people is to say the student needs to be suspended or expelled, or if you have an employee who makes a threat, that person needs to be put on leave, that person needs to be terminated. And, you know, I think these procedures and the trainings that we've been to would caution to kind of think a little bit more broadly, because just because a student is suspended doesn't mean they're not going to be able to make it onto campus and, do something that we're trying to avoid. Additionally, some of the highest risk times for students are after they've been out on a suspension, and then that first day that they come back, there's a higher likelihood of some sort of incident. And so I think that really highlights the need for those reintegration plans, a meeting when a student is returning from being gone or a staff member is returning from being gone, and then just looking at that full picture of it's not just discipline, but how do we support the student, how do we connect them with other adults, how do we develop their coping skills so we can avoid this negative, system of thought that the student has developed at that point. We kind of outlined what components we thought should be on your safety intervention plan, and you may want to create a form just to sort of guide your team and make sure that you've hit on all of the different pieces of it. You do want to coordinate with the student's IEP or 504 team if the student has already been identified as needing special education services. You're not going to have a joint meeting, but you want to have some people communicating and coordinating to make sure that the services and the interventions make sense and are not pulling the student in different directions. This may also be a red flag for a student who is a general education student that we need to do a case study. And so to be kind of thinking along those lines as well.
And I'll note with the safety intervention plan, and to make a correction in our cover letter to our procedure, this term, safety intervention plan, is not a term that's used by Dr. Cornell's model. It's a plan that, we have, it's an approach that we suggest in terms of a tool that you can use going forward for a particular student. As you determine and confirm what threat assessment protocols you're going to be using for your district, you may find that referring to the plan in using a different term or setting it up in a different way may work best. But this is an approach that we would recommend considering something like it at least.
Yeah, basically we made up that. So we have another question from one of our participants, and this is about sharing of information, which I know we're going to cover at some point, but I'll just put it out there. If we have a student that's made a substantive threat this year, is it permissible to go beyond the current teachers as far as notification and perhaps also provide the information about the threat to future high school teachers? Their claim is that future teachers also have a need to know. So I think that the Student Records Act provides good guidance on this. The Student Records Act says that people are privy to records or allowed to review records if they have a current demonstrable educational interest in the student. So if there is a substantive threat in the sophomore class, a member of the sophomore class right now in January 2020, and I only teach juniors, you don't need to tell me about that right now, unless it is a school-wide threat. However, if the teacher is, there's been a safety, with a substantive threat, you would put some sort of safety plan in place. And when that student goes to the next year and the next teacher, that safety plan would be a part of their record and then would be shared with teachers about, has it been resolved? Is there anything else we need to, are there warning signs? Do we need to, does the student have a mentor? Does the student have counseling in the school? Just the way you would share a behavior intervention plan for a special ed student, you would share it at that time. Now, resolved threats, I think, are a harder question because, again, the goal here is to bring the student back into the community. And I understand, and I completely, understand teachers that are worried for the safety of their students and their personal safety. But at the same time, just letting them know every single thing that happens, even after it's been resolved, may be a violation of a student's privacy rights. So I think that's a question best answered on a case-by-case basis, but certainly if you have a plan in place for a student and it's an intervention plan, you're going to be sharing that with the staff members who serve that student.
Right. And a follow-up question is, where should documents related to a threat assessment be filed? And I think that's going to depend sort of on how you store records within your district, and I think a lot of districts have, online in the cloud kinds of systems, and so you may want to look and see if you can create a particular file for this and control who has access to it, so that the appropriate people can access these records, and we're not in a situation where the information is siloed and people who need it don't have access to it, but it's not just widely available to people who don't necessarily need that information.
Right. This is really something that you, there is no prescription in the law for how you store these records. I think arguably they are student records, but I do think that keeping them someplace where people can access them, that has been a recommendation I have heard over and over again from psychologists who are experts in the field to the law enforcement agencies that are out front on this, mainly our federal law enforcement agencies, the FBI and the Secret Service. They really recommend a centralized system for keeping these records so that threat assessment teams and individuals in the school can access them as needed to monitor safety and risk.
And that administrators and other people that might come in contact with that student are aware of, whatever that threat has been and whatever the plan has been.
So that may involve some coordination with your electronic, record keeping system as well, to see how you're coding certain things that come through to help reach the goals that Kendra and Dana just described for maintaining those documents.
So talking a little bit more about the intervention plan, I think including the basic information about the students, their emergency contact, what was the threat, and then looking at what interventions were already in place and were those working, and then what are the next planned interventions and who's going to be responsible. And I think it is good to identify a particular person who serves sort of like a case manager who's going to be accountable to make sure that these things are in place and is following up with that student and to make sure all these pieces are moving forward. Similarly, having an intervention plan for the target if the threat was made against a particular person or group of people, to make sure that, that if it's a student, parents are aware of that, aware of what supports are available, and again, that person or that student has supports available and knows sort of who to go to if there's an issue going forward.
Okay, so we've already talked some about confidentiality and record keeping. The law does specifically say that any sharing of student information has to comply with FERPA and the Illinois School Student Records Act. Keep in mind then that as we've discussed, ISRA and FERPA allow for any school official who basically needs to know the information can have access to it within your school building. So that would include your district threat assessment team members and your school threat assessment team members. We'll talk about law enforcement in a second. But again, as we've discussed, there may be other staff members who need to know that information on a limited basis in order to best serve the student and the school community, and then you should be able to do that within that particular provision of ISRA. Law enforcement representatives, other than school resource officers who are working under a formal agreement, intergovernmental agreement, don't expressly have authorization to review records other than through the emergency exception of ISRA. And so what we recommend doing is to review your intergovernmental agreements that govern your relationship with your SRO as well as law enforcement to ensure that it allows for the free communication back and forth between your school districts and the law enforcement. FERPA actually has, the Department of Education has expressed guidance on how law enforcement serving on a school's threat assessment team can get get access to school records through the school official exception, as we have both under ISRA and FERPA. So if your intergovernmental agreement, as a best practice, we think if your intergovernmental agreement expressly acknowledges that for the purposes of your threat assessment team, the law enforcement representative or your SRO is considered to be a school official under that provision of ISRA, then that should help to allow for that free flowing of information without having to worry about invoking the emergency exception, which allows for the sharing of information, essentially if there's a health and safety emergency exception. The reason why that's important is because the Illinois School Student Records Act require that if you are going to share information under the emergency exception, that you notify parents following that disclosure. And so we would recommend reviewing your intergovernmental agreements to have those members of the threat assessment team be actually considered school officials for that purpose.
Okay, the law does create an exemption under FOIA, so records concerning the work of threat assessment teams are not FOIA-able. However, like we've been talking about, when these records do relate to particular students, they're probably going to be student records, which means parents would have access to them. And I think in general that's not problematic, but do be cognizant as you're doing your record keeping that if a parent makes a request for records, the parent is going to see the work that the team has done related to their own particular child. Now, to the extent you are working with your attorney, the attorney-client privilege may provide protection from disclosure really to anybody to the extent that you are working with your attorney and seeking legal advice about a particular situation. Finally, with record keeping, we've talked a little bit about this, but I think it's important to keep a record of, the agendas, meeting minutes, who attended your meeting, just to sort of be in a position to show that you have been taking these affirmative steps to monitor and prevent threats. You also want to keep records on the reports of individual threats and indicators of risk of targeted violence, and your safety plans and how those safety plans are being monitored. And so having a system where all of that stays organized and is accessible when someone needs access to that information. And sort of, we just have a note here to consider how and where records will be maintained. That's not required to be done in any particular way, and it's going to look different depending on the electronic systems that your district has in place. But kind of working through that as your team to figure out how to house that information so that it is accessible to the correct people. And then finally, we've just listed here, there are 2 slides with various information about different threat protocols, different information about school violence that you have available to review during all the time that you have to be working on this. And a lot of these really do have great resources, and so we do encourage you to check some of these out if you have questions. And then we have a couple minutes left if people have additional questions for us today.
And one thing that I will note, and then it looks like we might have a couple questions that we haven't gotten to yet, is just again to stress that we've put into place the procedure that is there as a suggested approach for you, but it is adaptable, and again, just want to underscore the importance of reviewing this and adapting it as is necessary for your district, but then ensuring what you do have in place is something that you will then plan to follow, recognizing that you can adapt it as you go.
So question here is, for high schools that are a different district than the elementary school district, do you need an intergovernmental agreement to share information as students rise to the high school level? And I think that, to the extent that we're creating student records related to a threat that a student has made that you've then investigated and put a plan in place, that's a student record that then can be transferred to the high school with the student's other records to the extent that it's still relevant. So if a threat is made in 8th grade and that plan is still active to be monitoring and supporting that student, then it definitely makes sense that that moves with the student to high school. On the other hand, if a student makes a threat in 3rd grade and it's resolved and there hasn't been additional problems since that time, at that point, at some point, temporary records that are irrelevant can be purged and, don't have to follow that student forever. So it would kind of depend on a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm. Looks like there's also a question about whether or not there's examples of intergovernmental agreements. There are some sort of, the Department of Education blessed intergovernmental agreements, I'll say, that, have been put out there as sort of models to use, or at least ones that you can pull from in terms of considering things to include in that agreement. And so we're happy to provide those resources if you want to, reach out to any one of us, and we can send you some of those resources to see how others are structuring these agreements.
Another question is someone who heard an FBI training and talking about actually employing law enforcement officials to have them as district employees to be able to receive the information. And I don't think that you need to actually employ the police officer. They can serve as a member of the team and sort of as an agent of the district through an agreement without being an employee of the district.
That's right. And, the FERPA guidance that I was referencing earlier, makes clear that so long as the school official, or so long as the law enforcement representative or the SRO is meeting certain requirements that have to be met in order for that person to be considered a school official under FERPA and ISRA, then that is sufficient. And so some of those requirements would really be just ensuring that they're not going to be disclosing that information to anyone else, that they're serving at the direction of the school. Those are all things that can be accounted for and encompassed in an intergovernmental agreement, which hopefully you have or are, looking to have in place, that would govern both a relationship with law enforcement, but also if you have SROs, it would govern that process as well.
So a couple quick questions. Can we add people to the threat assessment team, for example, special education staff? Absolutely. If you have other people that you want to put on that team, you can add people to meet the needs of your district, and special education staff might be relevant people to add with a good perspective. And then finally, a housekeeping question about whether you can download this presentation. And if you want to use the presentation internally within your own district, you can download it to do that. We do ask that you don't just email blast it out to all your colleagues at other districts, but within your own district, that is for your use.
Mm-hmm. And we wanted to provide this just as a way to kind of, in one central place, go through different things as far as the procedure and answer questions. Obviously, as you've looked through our cover letter, we've provided a lot of notes that also provide some of our commentary and additional things to consider with regard to the model procedure that we've offered to you. So please do ensure that you're reviewing that cover letter that goes with it, because we do flag a lot of different aspects for you to consider different things there. Do not hesitate to reach out to us as you're reviewing the procedure and how you're going to be implementing it and establish your team. If you have additional questions, we're happy to answer those. We're also happy to review intergovernmental agreements or additional things, as we typically do for all of you. With that, if there are not any other questions, we thank you for your time today and look forward to working with you as you implement your procedures and teams.